Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
And it's a real pleasure to have Mike Hulme with us today. He's not come all that far, he's come from Norwich, where he's been directing the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change, which he also founded about 7 years ago or so, wasn't it? He's done a lot of work with a lot of international governments and organisations, UNEP, UNDP, WWF, IPCC, UK government, for which he's to be greatly commended, because I think surviving all those official bodies is quite amazing, but well done. He has also been involved in the third IPCC and much involved in many aspects, both of the scientific aspects and the sociological aspects, and I'm looking forward to hearing a bit more about that as far as climate change is concerned. The other thing that you might have noticed is that for 12 years he wrote a weekly column for The Guardian, and on climate change, I guess, primarily. So that was going for a long time before it finally reached the public consciousness level that it's reached now. So today Mike's going to talk about three meanings of climate change: lamenting Eden, presaging apocalypse, and constructing Babel. So I'll hand over to you, Mike.
Thanks very much. Thank you for the invitation here this afternoon. What I'm going to be doing is giving a talk that I've never given before about climate change. So in a sense, you're a guinea pig audience to see how this goes down. What I'm trying to do is to look at climate change from a variety of different standpoints, drawing from ideas from environmental history, from sociology, and a little bit of ethics as well, I guess, to try to make sense of what has become this most intriguing and pervasive of phenomenon, the idea of climate change. I put this quote up here just to start, because in a sense what I'm going to be talking about is the idea of different ways of conducting our conversations about climate change, what might be called discourses. As Jamie Killingsworth and colleagues said, what is not always so clear, what the history of environmental rhetoric amply illustrates, is just how hard it is to predict the effect of a particular discourse on a particular audience at any given time. And what I'm going to be doing is suggesting three different ways of trying to interpret the conversations that we're hearing around the world about climate change. So let me kick off, and to a large extent I am going to be following my script to make sure I get it right. As I said, this is the first time I've given this particular seminar. The relationship between climate and society has been dynamic throughout human history and prehistory. It's a relationship which has been variously elemental, creative, at times fearful. The relationship has now taken a more intimate turn. Human actions, globally aggregated, are changing the composition of the world's atmosphere. And as Joseph Fourier, John Tyndall and Svante Arrhenius knew from the 19th century, changing the gaseous composition of our atmosphere inevitably will end up changing the functioning of our climate system. Future climates, therefore, will not be like past climates. Humans, we've often worried about this possibility. We've often worried about climate change. And now the knowledge claims of science have offered us new reasons to be concerned. Humanity is firmly embedded within the functioning of the climate system. We're now part of the climate system. But at the same time, this idea of anthropogenic climate change caused by us, is penetrating and changing society in novel ways. The past, through the historic emissions of greenhouse gases, and the future, through our predictions of future climate change, are interacting in new ways to provide a novel motor for cultural change. And this is all happening under the symbolism of global warming. But the constructions of narratives about global warming are very strongly tied to their roots in the natural sciences. to an expectation of improving prediction and linked to a framing of climate change in a problem-solution sense. Here's the problem, we need a solution. So, for example, the EU's policy goal of restricting global warming to no more than 2 degrees above pre-industrial level, it seems powerful, but actually it's quite a fragile policy goal, I would suggest. On the one hand, it's powerful because it can trace its lineage to the positivist and predictive natural sciences. If this is what we do, this is what will happen. But I would suggest it's also a fragile policy goal because it's constructed largely by elite and neoliberal Western minds. And this constructed policy goal then is unlikely to be one, I think, around which the world will be re-engineered willingly. Neither positivist science nor Western neoliberalism, I believe, will retain global hegemony. So that leads me to think that this phenomenon of climate change needs a new examination. And the re-examination should have a different starting point from the one we adopted in the 20th century. Those origins of climate change, particularly in the 1980s, when the idea of anthropogenic climate change first became truly public, the origins were found mostly in the scientific disciplines of the natural sciences and in the process of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. This process, this panel, which the outcomes rapidly came to dominate climate change discourse, and of course they still do, as we just saw a couple of weeks ago with the award of the Nobel Peace Prize this year, jointly to the IPCC. But re-examining climate change, I think today, we should start with contributions from the humanities and the social sciences, linked to a more critical reading of natural science, and informed by spatially and historically contingent views of knowledge. Knowledge is not immutable. And why is such a re-examination necessary? Well, I think it's necessary because the way we've constructed climate change at the moment as an overly physical phenomenon, what I'm suggesting here we might designate as climate change lowercase. So climate change lowercase, by which I mean the phenomenon, the physical phenomenon, which we approach through theory, observation, and models. But by focusing on the lowercase aspects of climate change, we allow climate change uppercase, what I'm suggesting we attach uppercase significance to, in which case here, what I'm talking about is the problem of climate change, which we approach through discourses, through values, and through ideologies. So by focusing on the lowercase, we've actually allowed climate change to be appropriated in support of a huge variety of different ideologies and projects. The ideologies, for example, of green colonialism, commodification of nature, the ideology of national security, of celebrity culture, and there are many, many others. Now, these creeds may or may not be undesirable. I'm not arguing, whether they are or not. My point is simply that by focusing on climate change purely as the lowercase phenomenon, with its largely material and global fixed properties, we've actually allowed climate change almost an infinite plasticity. It can be used and moulded in a huge variety of different ways. So climate change is used, therefore, to justify inter alia emissions trading, geoengineering, wind turbines, nuclear power, national identity cards, flight rationing, carbon offsetting. I could spend the next half an hour going through all of the things that climate change is now used to support. So climate change then becomes this malleable envoy enlisted in support of too many rulers. So I want to make a small contribution here to re-examining climate change, to see three ways in which the lowercase version gets loaded with sets of assumptions about the natural world and our relationship with it. In other words, how the lowercase climate change becomes the uppercase. I'm not suggesting that these three that I suggest are the only three such myths or ideologies, nor necessarily that they're the most important ones, but they are three that have struck me repeatedly over the last year or two as I've observed the language and rhetoric of climate change uppercase discourse. And I've given three biblical metaphors to these three myths simply because they seem to fit very nicely. The idea of lamenting Eden, of presaging apocalypse, and constructing Babel. So let me just run through what I suggest these three readings are. So here I'm suggesting that this ideology views climate as a repository of what is natural, something that is pure and pristine, something that should be beyond the reach of humans. Climate, therefore, becomes something that is fragile and needs to be protected or saved, just like the arguments about natural landscapes and animal species. These goals have fueled the romantic wilderness and environmental movements of the Western Enlightenment for 2 centuries or more. And to characterize this myth, I adopt this image of a lost Eden, the idea of loss, lament, and a yearning for restoration. As Genesis said, the Lord God banished him from the Garden of Eden to work the ground from which he'd been taken. And after he drove the man out, he placed on the east side of the Garden of Eden cherubim and a flaming sword flashing back and forth to guard the way to the tree of life. Now, this idea in relation to climate change has been partly explored by sociologist Steve Yearley at Edinburgh. He suggests that rather than being concerned about climate change for its substantive diminution of human welfare, there's a strong element of symbolism involved in our anxiety about climate change. We are so concerned about global warming, anthropogenic climate change, because climate has come to symbolize for us the last stronghold of nature, untainted by man. Bill McGibbon, in his classic book from 1989, The End of Nature, American journalist, he adopted this position very early on with respect to reasons for concern. His powerful lament for the end of nature found its highest expression in this transition from a natural climate to a climate which is now being modified through human impact on the global atmosphere. So he quotes, "A child will now never know a natural summer," unquote. And for McGibbon, that's a cause of deep sadness and of loss. If global climate is no longer safe from the contaminating influences of humanity, this speaks symbolically of just how deeply humans have penetrated the idea of the natural. Now, of course, when and why nature first became a separate category in the human imagination can be argued about, or indeed whether an independent category of wildness or wilderness exists in any substantive sense. Many anthropologists and environmental historians, Julie Cruikshank, Michael Thompson, Bill Cronin, will argue that the idea of nature as a separate category, distinct from culture, is something that can be studied objectively and therefore damaged by us, is an idea, an ideology, originating in the Enlightenment. It's an interpretation of the world that finds much rarer expression in traditional or non-Western societies, where nature and culture are viewed consistently as embedded categories. There's no nature unless interpreted by culture, and there's no culture disembodied from nature. However you argue this, and with anthropologists you can have a great argument, but there is no denying that the idea of wildness, wilderness, nature as separate, has been a persistent mode of discourse in Western rationalist cultures over recent centuries, even since that proto-romantic Jean-Jacques Rousseau first proposed to a project to reclaim a pure nature freed from human oppression. It's a persistent idea in Western intellectual thought. So this idea, this position that I call a lament for Eden, sees that by changing the climate, by losing wildness in one of the last untouched places, humans are diminishing not just themselves, but something beyond themselves. We are the poorer for it. This is a lament which underpins the deep ecology movement. And strains of this thinking in relation to climate change, I believe, have seeped much more widely into mainstream environmentalism. And they perhaps lie hidden in even broader discourses about climate change now in our liberal Western societies. So an ecological economist, colleague of mine, Paul Baer, challenges the World Bank economists, including Nick Stern, by rhetorically asking, what is the worth of an ice sheet? It wasn't valued by Nick Stern. And the polar bear, that hackneyed icon of climate change, ends up not just worrying about his own survival, but it has to carry a huge additional weight on its shoulders, the weight of human anguish. But if we do adopt this position, this particular myth, we have to ask, what is it exactly that is being lost as climates change? Climate is not like biodiversity, an absolute decline in species numbers or loss of ecosystem function, or even like ozone, where there's a direct physiological health hazard. As climates change, the various categories of weather, rain, hail, wind, are being rearranged to occur in different places and in different sequences. We're not losing clouds, we're not abandoning rainfall, we're not denying the sun. Certain climatic types might become extinct in one place, but new climatic types will emerge elsewhere. There's no such thing as a good climate or a bad climate in an absolute moral sense. There's only good ways or bad ways of living with climate. And if this position is merely lamenting the loss of the natural, as Bill McGibbon, for example, suggests, then climate change is only one more staging post on the long human journey that started 500,000 years ago with our domestication of fire as an agent of manipulation and control. It may be the culmination of that story, but it's consistent with that very long story. Climate change is no new category, and in which case lamenting Eden really is romantic idealism. Let me move on to my second idea around presaging apocalypse. Environmental discourses have long been clothed with the language of apocalypse, and here I do admit I'm using it in the more popular sense of the word, associated with ideas of destruction, rather than the original Greek and biblical form, which is simply around disclosure or revelation. Over 10 years ago, Jimmy Killingworth and Jackie Palmer, who I quoted from at the beginning, traced this genealogy of apocalyptic language back to the appearance in 1962 of Rachel Carson's book Silent Spring, and right the way through to what they identified as the new apocalypse of global warming, and passing along the way through Paul Ehrlich's 1968 book The Population Bomb and the 1972 Club of Rome's Limits to Growth. And since they wrote that genealogy in 1996, 10 years ago, and especially over the last 3 or 4 years in Western Europe and North America, I suggest possibly since 9/11, this apocalyptic narrative of climate change has become more dominant. The linguistic repertoire of this discourse draws upon categories like impending disaster, approaching tipping points, species wiped out, billions of humans at risk from death. There are no end of headlines in print and on screen that are framed in this way. Time magazine, for example, be worried, be very worried. A separate category of climate change is invented. Catastrophic climate change now is distinct from climate change. Just notice how many times you see and hear climate change being qualified with an adjective. We can't have just climate change, we now have to have it's either catastrophic climate change, it's abrupt climate change, it's dangerous climate change, it's devastating climate change. Very rarely here in popular media discourse, simply climate change. It's almost as though there are two distinct subspecies of the phenomenon. And we see evidence of this particular linguistic form in places where we would expect it, in the media, environmental campaigners and so on, but also in the words of civil servants. So, for example, I include David King in this, when his claim was that climate change is a bigger threat than global terrorism. Jim Lovelock, of course, in his book The Revenge of Gaia, here we see that by so abusing the Earth, it may rise and move back to the hot state it was in 55 million years ago, and if it does, most of us and our descendants will die. This contrasts, for example, with the less passionate and less loaded language used by the IPCC. Just taking one quote from the most recent assessment: abrupt climate changes such as the collapse of the West Antarctic ice sheet, the rapid loss of the Greenland ice sheet, or large-scale changes in ocean circulation are not considered likely to occur in the 21st century. Visual imagery, too, is part of this myth of apocalypse. Carving of ice from the Greenland ice sheet and model simulations of a world without summer Arctic sea ice being the most evocative of these. Now, what does this framing of climate change do to audiences around the world? It undoubtedly leads a sense of danger, fear, and urgency, introduces those into discourses about climate change. And again, just more examples, they're not hard to find. I particularly like that one there, the 40 degrees. The Independent ran with this on the 28th of April this year, before summer started, saying that as April temperatures break all records, will this be the summer when Britain reaches 40 degrees Celsius? Well, they knew something maybe that none of us knew. It most certainly wasn't 40 degrees this summer. But there are many other examples as well. The final warning last year, 10 years to save the world, etc. Such stark language, it certainly denies audiences the choice to ignore climate change. It's in your face. It's presented in such a way that you cannot ignore it. But we hear claims that we've only got 10 years, or maybe it's 8, maybe 15 years to save the planet. Again, this Times headline here, last warning, 10 years to save the world, or to reduce emissions. The UK civil movement, Stop Climate Chaos, has become expert in deploying this urgency in their lobbying of Parliament and in their public protestations, as we saw at Heathrow in August. But heightening saliency and awareness of the issue of climate change is rather too easy a goal. A counterintuitive outcome of such language is that it leads to disempowerment, apathy, and scepticism amongst its audience. Several studies, not only in relation to climate change, have shown that promoting fear is an ineffective, even counterproductive way of inducing attitudinal or behavioural change. If such change really is what this ideology of apocalypse is seeking, then it might be self-defeating. Why should climate change be couched this way? It's not always been so. But I suggest there are perhaps three dimensions as to why we've seen the consolidation of apocalypse in recent years. First, perhaps drawing from this myth of a fragile Earth and a disappearing climate, what I said before, the enduring fear of the future, the human fear of the future, has fueled these descriptions of the climate system on a point of collapse. It fits very well with a particular view of nature as fragile or ephemeral, as originally proposed by Buzz Holling back in the 1980s. Secondly, this rhetoric has been fueled by the new paradigm that now affects Earth system science, the idea of system complexity, thresholds and tipping points. Working with this new paradigm, models of the Earth system are able to find an increasing number of choke points in their model worlds when non-linear changes in climate seem to occur. And third, I think it's partly been a response of frustration on the part of advocates to the apparent failures of international measures and agreements to start slowing the growth in carbon emissions. And as we all know, carbon emissions are continuing to rise by 3% per year globally, irrespective of everything that's gone on. So the instinctive reaction to such perceived failure is to turn the dial on the amplifier a notch higher and proclaim that the risks of climate change are even greater than first thought. Surely, if we just turn up the volume, things will change. Now, of course, the purpose of environmental rhetoric, as Killingworth and Palmer pointed out 10 years ago, it's always been to change the future and not to predict it. Paul Ehrlich, for example, he claims that by painting in the late 1960s a scenario of a dysfunctional and Malthusian world owing to unfettered population growth, which is what he was warning about in 1968, he in fact contributed to a slowing down of population growth, thereby averting the very scenario he painted. And that will be what many would say about environmental rhetoric. We're not actually predicting this, we're actually trying to avoid it. But I sense there's now a new literalism here in the climate change discourse of climate apocalypse. Spokespersons such as Jim Lovelock and James Hansen are claiming to be basing their rhetoric literally on the claims of science of the IPCC. I don't believe these authors think they're being rhetorical. So climate as apocalypse is essentially a call to arms. But rather than mere rhetoric, it's a call that involves sound science as its legitimizer. It's different in that sense from 1960s environmental radicalism. And in fact, it's different too because it can bifurcate into any number of quite different policy propositions. So this discourse of climate as apocalypse can support radical ecology, a more moderate ecological modernisation. It can support social activism, neoliberal conservatism. All of these projects can gain power from the idea of climate as apocalypse. The one thing that they all share is the ideology of control. And that's where I come on to my third position, which I call constructing Babel, the ideology of control. Now this is not necessarily an ideology that is orthogonal, that is opposite to either of the previous two. Indeed, it gains some of its legitimacy from narrating climate change as catastrophe. As the Genesis myth of Babel relates, a confident and independent humanity, repopulated after the traumas of the flood, claimed, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we might make a name for ourselves and not be scattered over the face of the earth." This aspiration towards godlike status, acclaim and personal glory, exemplifies the Greek idea of hubris. And I want to suggest that this confident belief in the human ability to control is the dominant mindset of the civil intelligentsia of the West. The challenges of climate change here are seen in essentially modernist terms. As with clean air, with tobacco smoking, with ozone depletion, once a risk is identified, then the apparatus of the state, or in the case of climate change, the apparatus of many states, needs to be mobilized to mitigate the risk. Perhaps drawing emotional power from the bullying language of climate change as apocalypse, the management of climate change becomes the latest project over which human governance, control, and mastery is demanded. This can explain the fanfares which greeted the Kyoto Protocol on its signing in 1997, its ratification in 2005, an agreement which mimicked the Montreal Ozone Protocol and suggested that we were on the way to full climate control. It can also explain the urgent tones to the Stern Review last year, which laid out, using the tools of neoclassical economists, economics, a rational argument as to why stabilization of carbon dioxide at between 450 parts per million and 550 parts per million could and should be achieved. It explains too a range of advocacy, from biofuels to emissions trading to green taxes. The climate needs saving, and we humans can do it. For example, this has sparked a green gold rush. That's one other example of the idea of control. This is an advertising campaign here from the EU. You control climate change. This language of mastery and control. And then the Financial Times, a quote here: the growing political salience of environmental politics has sparked a green gold rush, which has seen a dramatic expansion in the number of businesses offering both companies and individuals the chance to go carbon neutral, offsetting their own energy use by buying carbon credits that cancel out their contribution. So this ideology of political control and climatic mastery also has an interesting sub-variant, the variant of geoengineering. This narrative, drawing power from the modelling claims of the Earth system scientists, argues that exactly because we are unlikely to realise our Tower of Babel using conventional instruments of diplomacy, trade and fiscal regulation, we need a new form of intervention to bring a runaway climate under human management. Jim Lovelock and Chris Rapley just a couple of weeks ago captured this mood perfectly in their letter to Nature when they claimed that amplifying feedbacks, the inertia of the Earth system and that of our response, make it doubtful that any of the well-intentioned technical or social schemes for carbon dieting will restore the status quo. They then propose a large-scale scheme for sucking up cold, nutrient-rich waters from the deep ocean to the surface, where they can fertilise algae who will feed on the CO2 in the atmosphere and thus sequester it. They claim if we can't heal the planet directly, we may be able to help the planet heal itself. It seems to me there's a deep irony here. A, the inadvertent side effects of carbon-fueled economic growth are charged with destabilising our climate. B, the claim is that all efforts of using conventional human control systems to rein in the damage are doomed to fail. And C, therefore, a new large-scale geophysical experiment with a planet is proposed. The only difference between this experiment and the last one is that we now have the wisdom of Earth system models to guide us. Whether one believes in the officers of the World Bank, the efficacy of the traditional nation-state, or the scientific high priests of Gaia, believing that we can make a name for ourselves by stabilising global climate requires an inordinate degree of faith. In conclusion, where does this take us? I've suggested three underlying ideologies or myths that shape and inflect our narratives about climate change. Climate change as a lament, climate change as fear, climate change as hubris. They're not exclusive positions. Indeed, very likely one finds the thread of all three entangling themselves in the beliefs about climate change held by many of us, perhaps myself included, and in the express claims of what must be done. And they're not, I'm sure, the only ideological positions that could be taken. I'm not claiming that. But I do think it's very important that we analyse this phenomenon of climate change, uppercase, at this deeper level. It is simplistic and trite to suggest that there are those who believe in the science of climate change and there are those who don't. This really tells us nothing. Certainly nothing about climate change uppercase. Equally, it gets us nowhere to castigate George Bush and American Republicans as being the real obstacle to progress on tackling climate change. Are people really suggesting that under the leadership of the Democrats, American society would have turned around and become exemplary in their consumption habits? Now, what science can tell us about climate change, lowercase, whether through IPCC reports, National Science Foundation reviews, Nature and Science papers, what science cannot do is present us with a script from which we can read these ideologies. Science endorses only itself. It doesn't endorse any other ideology. We are allowing ourselves to get into a hopeless muddle by confusing lowercase and uppercase climate change. I believe it's only at this deeper level of analysis that we can begin to see what really is at stake over climate change. Should our focus of concern lie with the diminution of this category we in the West have invented? We call it nature. In which case, climate change really is about a symbolic loss, a loss in our imaginative capacities, rather than a loss of something substantive. If this is so, it would certainly help to explain why the reaction to climate change around the world is so heterogeneous and disputed. The symbolism of climate has a wide diversity of interpretations across cultures and traditions. It doesn't just mean one thing. Or maybe anthropogenic climate change really has introduced an absolute limit to human survival on the planet. Is the melting of the Greenland ice sheet really the end of civilization? And do we really have just 10 years to save the world? Has science, once and for all, in an ultimate sense, replaced the prophets of religion and astrology? Or, thirdly, is climate change all about global governance, new institutions for a new millennium? Here, climate change demands that we deliver on this hubristic goal of restabilising world climate at some new safe level by inventing new institutions of governance and then re-engineering our social behaviour towards this long-term goal. But in the history of humanity, we certainly have never got close to achieving such a project before. Stalin's 5-year plans, the Great Leap Forward in China, were doomed to disaster. Now, these are rhetorical questions that I'm asking here, so let me end with an alternative proposition, in case I'm being accused of too much cynicism. Here, I suggest, so in this alternative proposition, I suggest that we are using climate change, uppercase, to distract ourselves from the really rather uncomfortable perversions that exist in our world. So many of them are results of our infatuation with economic growth at the expense of human health and social justice. One unavoidable question to ask is, why do we not see the same political energy and social capital being invested in the achievement of the Millennium Development Goals, as we see daily in the drive to establish a global climate regime? The MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, eradication of extreme poverty, hunger, reduce child mortality, achieve universal primary education, etc., are now only 8 years from delivery. Is climate change, uppercase, in fact a case of convenient transference of ethical concern away from the urgent and important to the distant and the unachievable? Is climate change, rather than being an inconvenient truth, in fact being used as a very convenient category because it offers us a psychological focus for our loss of the past, our fear of the future, and our instinct for hubris? We're using climate change, in fact, to act as a conduit for serving and meeting these deeper psychological needs. The function of climate change, uppercase then, I suggest, is not as a problem physically to be solved. It's not really about stopping climate chaos. Instead, we should be using the idea of climate change, the matrix of power relationships, various social meanings, the different cultural discourses that climate change throws up and reveals. We should use the idea of climate change to rethink how we take forward our political, social, and economic projects in the decades to come. We should use climate change as a magnifying glass in more forensic and honest examinations than we've been used to for each of our projects. The projects of economic growth, of free trade, of poverty reduction, of community building, of demographic management, of social health, etc., etc. I could go on. Let us use the magnifying power of climate change, the things that climate change teaches us, and here I just suggest 4 things that climate change teaches us. Its focus on long-term implications of short-term choices, its global reach, that we are interconnected, the revelation of new centres of power. It's no longer just about the nation state, and its attention to both material and cultural values. These are the things that climate change can teach us, and we should use those to attend more closely to the things that we really want to achieve for humanity, whether this be affluence, justice, or mere survival. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike. Well, that leaves plenty of time for questions or comments from people. I wonder if anybody would like to start. We've got a microphone, so everybody can hear you. Can you speak into the mic?
Thank you, it's a fascinating talk. I just wonder, in comparison with the Millennium Development Goals, which haven't got the same sort of attention in our society as climate change, whether one reason might be that the Millennium Development Goals are mainly concerned with bringing benefit to people a long way away from us. And whereas climate change also is of particular importance to them, what we've been reading in the media recently is that it could actually affect us in this country. And even last year there were serious floods which may have been connected with that. And I wonder whether there is the feeling that this really does affect our society, whereas Millennium Development Goals, it's mainly concerned with people out there that we ought to be concerned about, but maybe we're not in practice. Any comments?
Yeah, well, I think it is interesting to try and understand why attention seems to be so skewed, certainly in Western countries, around these two issues. Of course, one of the most frequently heard justifications for taking action on climate change is the supposed welfare of people a long way away, but people a long way away in time. So it's our grandchildren, or it's future generations that we're supposed to be benefiting. The MDGs, as you point out, is largely about improving the human welfare of people a long way away, but in space. So why the asymmetry? Why is it that we seem to be more motivated emotionally by people who've not yet been born? Is it because they simply are people in our imagination we can think of as our descendants with some genetic connection to us, rather than other human beings who are deeply unprivileged at the moment and exposed to a whole variety of risks? And most of those risks that are climate related are risks that are not due to climate change. I mean, they're simply the inherent dangers of living with climate. I said before that there are no such things as good climates and bad climates. Simply good ways of living with climate and bad ways of living with climate. And unfortunately, many people in our world are exposed to vulnerable ways of living with climate. But we don't seem to be motivated to take action in that sense, whilst at the same time being called upon to take action to benefit people as yet unborn and unseen. So again, I think there's some psychological transference here of responsibility that is going on. And in that sense, this is what I mean by climate change. Perhaps actually it's a very convenient problem, because it actually allows us to take attention away from other things that are deeply perverted in our world.
Thank you. I very much enjoyed your use of the biblical models of people's way of trying to grapple with climate change, and in some sense saying in the end that they're all to a certain extent flawed. So I'd like to offer a different biblical model, and that is the story of Joseph in Egypt, where you can regard the story as being one which is about dreams and interpretation and mythologies, but you can also look at it as a story of somebody who is extraordinarily perceptive and sees that sometimes the climate goes well and everything works and everything grows and you're reliant on the Nile floods and they come right and you have a good harvest. But sometimes it goes disastrously wrong, and this is what happens normally throughout the world all the time. We're a bit shielded from it because if it goes wrong for us, you still go around to the supermarket and there's stuff there. But I was in Spain last month and saw hailstones take every olive off the trees. There's no harvest. You know, the same can happen to the grapes or the tomatoes or whatever it is. You know, there's that kind of disaster in the weather all the time. And it's not necessarily climate change, but what Joseph was looking at was a situation in which if you couldn't feed everybody, there'd be a riot. The whole state would break down. And in our terms, if you can't feed anybody, to some extent, the whole world breaks down and everybody invades the countries that have got sufficient resources, sufficient money, sufficient jobs, and we have a crisis on everybody's hands. It's not just in the Nile. But Joseph gave himself, by his own cleverness, 14 years in which to plan. And nobody gets that because the plan's rubbished in the following day's newspapers today, isn't it? And it's that kind of longer term strategy in the Joseph story, recognizing the huge variables that we've got that might provide a better biblical model for how we cope not with whether it's climate change, but the huge variable nature of climate as we know it anyway.
Thank you. Not a comment rather than a question, but I think that's a nice introduction of another biblical story. And I think the point there is about foresight and about planning. I mean, thinking off the top of my head here, actually Joseph, used the traditional knowledge of the Egyptians about the 7 years flood and the 7 years of low flows. In fact, that cycle in the Nile, I remember having a conversation with an Egyptian irrigation engineer in Cairo who were adamant that 7 year cycle actually is still pertinent today. But it's using traditional knowledge in that case, or scientific knowledge today, in order to develop foresight and planning to minimise risk and danger to human welfare. And that's a fundamental responsibility on all of us. And in relation to climate change, there are many things that we can do by using our knowledge of foresight in order to reduce the risks that climate presents us with. And again, I wouldn't try to put a wedge between the risks that climate presents us with and the wedge that and the risks that climate change might in the future introduce. We're all exposed to climate risks. And the point again that I said before is there are many, many people in the world today who are not getting the benefit of our scientific knowledge of foresight because they're exposed to risks that we here would regard as completely intolerable. So absolutely, use foresight, use planning, use our knowledge, but let's use it universally around the world, just like Joseph did, or at least he did for the Egyptians. And actually, yes, his family outside Egypt benefited in the end as well, didn't they?
Jason.
I'm wondering if it reinforces your point that these ideologies have been constructed in order to push away from us more serious moral problems. I wonder if that's reinforced by the point that among these ideologies you don't see a moral ideology, that is, climate change is a problem of greed, gluttony, and sloth. You care to comment on that?
Not in those words. I suppose implicitly there are some analyses that undoubtedly draw attention to that. I mean, the whole idea of carbon consumption or carbon rationing, in a sense, implicitly carries some of that connotation. You know, one of the ideas put forward is that we should actually move towards a more equitable quota system for carbon consumption. The implication being that there are those people of us who are over-consuming, and then we should be reined back in our bad habits. But yes, I mean, it's very rare that you'll find that much deeper analysis of what underpins. And again, here it's not just climate change, is it? I mean, climate change, in a sense, is a proxy for many of the environmental challenges that face us in the world, and many of them can be traced back to this ideology of growth through consumption. The Stern Review, the interesting thing about the Stern Review, it used some of the classical tools of economics to do its analysis, and it came up with a headline that unmitigated climate change could lead to a loss of between 5 and 20% of global wealth production. What wasn't pointed out was that the underpinning analysis in the Stern Review, by looking ahead to the year 2100 and the year 2200, the underlying assumption was that the world in the year 2100 would be 8 times wealthier than the world of today. The implicit assumption was that economic growth unfettered at 2% would continue. And therefore, just if you take the analysis on those terms, the 5 to 20% loss of global world production means that rather than being 8 times wealthier, we'd only be 7.5 times wealthier. But implicit is this ideology, and it is an ideology that, and it's a neoliberal tenet of our 21st century, that growth, economic growth is measured through conventional GDP metrics, is actually what the human project is all about. Which is why I ended by actually saying, you know, whatever our, what is it we really want to achieve for humanity? Is it affluence? Or is it justice? Or is it mere survival? So I do think that's the level of analysis that actually we need to start digging into. And it becomes very, very uncomfortable when you start tackling it at that sort of a level.
Yeah. I'll just wait for the microphone.
I was interested in what distinction you made between two lower C, climate change, and upper, because I think it bears on the question of communicating about science and the futures of science.
My experience was in genetic modification of crops and foods, and for the last 10 years the debate has failed to engage, and that people talk past each other, and they talk past each other because they have different objectives. The scientific community says the evidence shows, and we must use evidence, and the other communities have different agenda, very, very like the ones you were indicating, and so there has been no resolution of these issues. The analogy we've used, or I've used in writing, is that GM, like climate change, is a lightning rod for concerns in the modern world. These concerns are all out there, and then a new technology comes which might be threatening, or can be made to appear threatening, or is threatening. But everybody's concerns weigh in on them. And we are not finding any easy way to resolve that, politically or in a society. Any comment?
Yeah, I think you're picking up on exactly one of my themes, and why I suggest trying to differentiate between the lowercase and the uppercase is that climate change. If you have a debate about climate change, then it's not a debate about the physical phenomenon. There are many, many other things that are simply drawn into that debate, and unless you can find ways of distinguishing, the debate seems to, on the surface, be all about science. It's not about science. I mean, there's so much good quality science out there that has made it very, very clear the basic parameters of what's happening to the world's climate. There are always uncertainties, and there always will be uncertainties, but the basic parameters of what is happening to climate are pretty well known. It's not a debate about that science. So in a sense, the lowercase, what I'm trying to do is say, let's settle the lowercase issue. What's happening is that the arguments are really about the uppercase. It's around the issues of values, of ultimate objectives, how you achieve those objectives, issues of justice, all of the things that I guess you were alluding to got drawn into the GM debate are similarly being sucked into the climate change debate. And that's why Bob was asking me beforehand. I'd written something on one of the open websites about Al Gore and the Peace Prize, and I was expressing a degree of skepticism, perhaps was the word. We've only just begun on climate change. It's not about settling the science. That's point zero. The real debate is only just beginning. And to claim that peace is breaking out because of the IPCC and Al Gore, I think is simply sticking too much at the surface here. It really is about, in the end, some very, very deep issues about what the purpose of humanity is on the planet. And that raises all of the political and all of the ethical dilemmas that confront us. And we haven't got close to resolving those.
Well, thank you, Mike. I'm afraid we'll have to stop now because we do make a point of stopping at not 3 o'clock because that's British summertime, but 2 o'clock, so don't panic, GMT, so that people can get away to other meetings. But I'm sure Mike will be around for a little while yet if you want to come and talk personally. Something really rang a bell with what you're saying, which is that the scientific theory of evolution in the centuries since has been taken over for all sorts of different ideologies, from communism to capitalism to all sorts of other isms, which it just is not designed to carry, is it? And it was good to hear the warning from you that climate change is possibly going down that same route of trying to carry, being made to carry things, isms, ideologies that it shouldn't ever do. So that's great to hear it coming from somebody who's head of a climate change institute. Just a couple of things to say at the end. There is a great bookstall over there with books, DVDs and so on, all sold at less than their list price. We sell them as cheap as we can, so do make use of that. And the other thing to say is that in 2 weeks from now, same place, same time, there'll be a talk by Peter Harrison, a really good historian, just been appointed professor at Oxford University. So do put that in your diaries if you can. So it remains to thank Mike again. Thank you.